Well, good morning. It is a delight to be out. We welcome all of you. We're thankful for your presence. We welcome those who have joined us by way of Facebook. We thank you for your attention in these classes. We ask that if you hear something that you have never heard before, you have questions, that you would reach out and allow us the blessed opportunity to answer your questions. If you are watching this sometime in the future by way of YouTube or Facebook, we thank you for that. We are going to finish up Matthew chapter 11. So if you'll open up, we ended right at the great invitation last week that we all know so well, verses 28 through 30. And then prayerfully, we will get into chapter 12 as the Lord blesses us to do so. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse number 28, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." That is three of the finest verses that we have ever considered, and that we have hidden in our hearts because of what they mean to us as Jesus is dealing with people who hate him. He is dealing with people that have rejected him. You remember last week we talked about how he had gone through Capernaum and he had gone through these areas, and he said, you know, if Tyre and Sidon had seen the great works which were done in you, they would have repented. But these people just paid no attention to Jesus Christ. They dismissed him, if you will. But Jesus' favorite words, come. Come to me. That great invitation that Jesus offers. Jesus drives no man away. Jesus says, come. Come to me. And it's this word, this idea we find throughout the scriptures of Jesus begging people to come. In the book of Revelation, chapter 22, I believe it's about verse 17, where he says, "The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him who is athirst come. Let whosoever will come. Take of the water of life freely." Hey, Jesus wants us to come. But there is a method in which we must come. We must come to Jesus on his terms. We must come to Jesus through faith. There is no doubt about that at all. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. And it is by faith that we have peace with God. Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. But it is this faith that we must have, this belief in Jesus, John 8 and 24. We must have that. Romans chapter 10 and verse number 17. And in believing this Jesus, in believing in the deity of our Lord, those that come to him must come to him repenting of their sins. Luke chapter 13 and verse 3, Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. People that come to Jesus must come penitent, repenting. And those penitent believers that believe on Jesus, that come to Jesus, must confess his name. That's something that just we can't get around. We can't apologize for. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, Jesus had said, "Those that confess me before men, them also will I confess before my Father which is in heaven." In Romans chapter 10 and verse 10, we confess unto salvation. That is something that gets us closer and closer to Christ. But those penitent believers that confess the Lord then are subjects qualified to be baptized into him. Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 and 27. Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. Colossians chapter 2, verses 12 and following, where we are buried with him by baptism. There's so many verses that we could cover. But that's how we come to Jesus, on his terms. And he offers this invitation, all ye that labor. You know, we have burdens that are our own, that we labor burdened of our own burdens. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul would tell the Christians in Galatia, you bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But let every man, watch this, prove his own work. Then he shall have rejoicing in himself and not in another, for he shall bear his own burden. Go ahead.
And if so, you will enter into my rest. And you said, basically with God's blessing, we'll get on into 12, and I hope not to be thwarting that, but I wanted to bring in Hebrews. And the Hebrew writer at the end of the 3rd chapter, I won't read where he first references it. For some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all came out of Egypt by Moses, but with whom he was grieved 40 years, was it not them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, and to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter in because of disbelief, the point you just made in another passage. As we go into Hebrews chapter 4, let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest. And that's what we're reading about in Matthew. There is a promise to us, and we fear lest this promise of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it.
Yep.
So if we get to the point that we don't really believe, I've heard people say, well, it's good to question. You better make it through that questioning.
Right, yes. Anything short of that is coming short. Yeah. And he says, and so we all have burdens of ourselves, but then he says, and are heavy laden. And these are burdens that other people bind on you. You remember Jesus, and we're going to get there eventually, but in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites, for you bind heavy burdens on other people, and you're not even willing to lift a finger to those very things. There are burdens that other people lay upon us. Now, this is something that we find which is common to all mankind. We all have our own labors and our own heavy ladens, if you will. We all are burdened and laden with the struggle against sin, against temptation. And if we will yoke up with Jesus, we can have rest, if you will, from those things. We can, with Christ, overcome sin and temptation. He says, come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And he's talking in some way about partnership. Because he says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. You know, the yoke is that instrument which binds beasts of burden together so that they become a team, so that they become as one instrument. Reading behind Kaufman said that in the South Korean, it's called Busan, it's a place in South Korea. He said that this writer was writing that he was watching this old papasan, this old male figure, if you will, carrying a load of hay which he should never have been carrying. And upon further investigation, he found that this old man had an A-frame that went behind him, that was put on him as a yoke, and the hay was stacked upon that A-frame. And it allowed him to carry a burden that he would have never been able to carry just with his hands. And it is this type of image that Jesus says, you yoke up with me, and those things which are unbearable, you will be able to bear them in me, with my people. There is a comfort. There is a promise, an assurance that is out in front of the believers, but not only out in front of the believers, but beside and with the believers, that allows us to get through and to traverse whatever it is that we go through. He says, you will find rest unto your souls. Somebody get Jeremiah 6:16. Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16.
Thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your soul, but they say, we will not walk in it.
You know, God's way, throughout every dispensation, through the patriarchal dispensation, through the Mosaical dispensation, and now in the Christian dispensation, when we walk in God's way, when we walk in His way, when we seek the old path and just walk therein, rest is available. If we'll just submit to God, if we will just do those things which we know that He commands of us, there is rest in there. Because He says in verse 30, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You recall that song we sing, anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere He leads me in this world below, anywhere without Him, dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Because when I am yoked up with Jesus, it does not matter, come what may, I have a helper. I have an advocate. I have a trailblazer. I have a captain. I have a forerunner. I have a savior. I have a father. I have a friend. I have everything literally that I need yoked up with Jesus. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that comforting? Jesus offers this to every single person. Come to me. Come to me. Take my yoke upon you. If you don't take the yoke of Jesus upon you, the world will throw its yoke upon you. You're going to pick your struggle. You're going to pick your battle. You can either battle with the Lord, or you can allow the world to yoke you up with all of its problems and all of the devil's desires for your life, and see how you come out better. Choose the yoke of Jesus. He begins in chapter 12. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and His disciples were anhungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto Him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. But He said unto them, have you not read? We're going to stop right there and unpack a little bit of this. Jesus goes about His business, and this is on the Sabbath day. And they go through the corn, and you notice the first thing that jumps out to me is His disciples are hungry. Do you recall last week when we mentioned the fact that Jesus never used the miraculous gifts to benefit Himself or His disciples alone? Never. Not once. His disciples are following Him. His disciples are working for Him. His disciples are doing what He has them to do. And they're poor. They do not have the means to get food and acquire food as the rest, the normal people, the people that are going about their own business do. And they are hungry. And Jesus doesn't command the stones to become bread, But his disciples are going through this field of grain, probably barley or something like that. It's not literal corn, if you will. But the law provided for the poor and the travelers. The farmers were not to glean the corners and the edges of the field, but were to leave that for the poor and for those who were traversing on a journey. And these disciples reach over in and just are able to grab some grain. And they take this grain within their hands and they roll it as to separate it from the chaff and to get it out where they can eat it. They can put some sustenance in their tummy. They can put something in their belly. And the Pharisees, now notice this is on the Sabbath day and they've set up a watch, haven't they? They're watching Jesus and his disciples. And the Pharisees see it and they say, "Behold, your disciples are doing that which is not lawful." Now, the Sabbath certainly had law. There was doctrine concerning the Sabbath day. But what had the rabbis and the Pharisees, what had they done with the law?
Made it punitive, to use one of our...
Yeah, and they had so
weaponized it.
expounded upon the law. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to point out, you said they had a watch to see what they were doing. It was lawful to hand somebody a piece of bread on the Sabbath. And the same guy that's watching this happen, he could have handed them a piece of bread and they wouldn't be plucking ears
Right.
of grain. And look at what they did instead.
Right.
In our terms, they weaponized the law.
Yeah, so, and these guys are not stealing. They're not stealing the grain because they have a provision within the law that they can, with their hand, grab the grain. The law forbade them to use a sickle in the man's field. They weren't allowed to do that. But that's not what they did. Everything that they did was within the law. But the Pharisees and the teachers over time had so embellished the law. They had created all kinds of different ordinances and standards and things, probably with good intentions, but they had gone so far beyond what God had intended. And he says, when they are doing this, they're calling the unlawful act of just eating the bread, well, they're reaping. They have reaped some wheat. And then they begin to thresh it. And if they separate it, now they're winnowing it. And so they're really doing work, right? They are working and they are in violation of the law. They do all this and they're preparing food. That's what the Pharisees' position is, ridiculous as it is. And Jesus brings up three principles. There are three principles in these next about 5 verses or so.
Robby, one thing, you don't care before you go there. One thing about the Pharisees, they refused to listen, but they watched and added to and made the law harder. Similar to the religious world today, refusing to listen, but actually doing the opposite and loosening God's word.
Right.
Make things easier for them. So both refused to listen, decided to do opposite things really with the law. Pharisees to embellish and make it harder, and the religious world today to loosen it so that everybody's okay.
Vance, I noticed you weren't at Christmas Mass. You were here Wednesday night, but they had Mass that morning,
Yeah.
and you weren't there.
I don't know.
You know, one of the interesting things, just as a side note, we're studying the Proverbs on Wednesday nights. And at this day and time, when Jesus was going about the Proverbs were available to them. They had those writings. Solomon had compiled this. And in Proverbs 17:15, we find a verse that should have struck the Pharisees and scared them to death. But Proverbs 17:15 says that he that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the just are both an abomination to the Lord. If you justify wickedness and you justify sin, that's wrong. But if you take someone's liberty from them and you condemn them in a just action, that's just as wrong. Both are an abomination to the Lord. And therein, God condemns liberalism and legalism. What God is looking for is scriptural. What has God said? They that justify the wicked, they that condemn the just, are both an abomination to the Lord. And what are the Pharisees doing here? They're condemning just men. They haven't broken any law, and so there are three principles that he brings up. Jesus said unto them, have you not read? It's interesting that Jesus constantly points people to the Scriptures. In his temptation in the wilderness, what did Jesus do with the devil? But it is written. It is written. It is written. Jesus took the devil's misuse of the text and pointed him to, no, this is what God's law says. And I'm not going to stand for you to abuse it and to misuse it. Well, the same principle is true here. He is going to say, have you not read what David did when he was hungered and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priest. During the wilderness wanderings, the tabernacle is set up, and then once the temple is built, the table of showbread, which was there with all the other holy instruments, upon that table of showbread, every week was baked a loaf of bread representing each tribe. And at the end of the week, they would bake new loaves of bread and put the fresh bread upon the table, and the priest would then eat the bread from the previous week, and it was only for the priest. That is written. That's law. Jesus brings up something here from 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David is on the run, he and his men, and we know that he is being hunted, and Saul's seeking his life, and he goes into and takes the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat. It was only for the priest. And why is it important that Jesus brings this up? I would suggest firstly because these Pharisees, they love David. They're going to justify David. They're going to make sure that David has his rightful place in their history in standing with God. David, you can't condemn David. David is the darling of Israel, right? And so that's one of the reasons. He says, have you not read that David, what he did, and it was not lawful for him to eat? He's going to make the point here in the end. And the reason Jesus brings this up, it suggests to us, it implies to us also that David did this on the Sabbath day. So that was the Sabbath is the context to which we're talking. And then in verse 5, he says, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath day the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? This is going to be principle number 2. He says, I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. The priest profaned the Sabbath and they are blameless in it. Jesus is saying the Sabbath laws are not universal. Because on the Sabbath, what do the priests do?
Work.
Oh, they work. Not only do they work, but all the offerings, all the sacrifices are doubled on the Sabbath. They work twice as hard on the Sabbath as they do during the rest of the week. There are twice as many offerings, twice as many bulls and goats prepared, twice as many offerings of incense, twice as much work. And they profane, if you will, the Sabbath by the commandment of God when there was supposed to be no work. They're blameless in that. Why are they blameless? They're working for God. They're working for their fellow man. The law was not universal, you see. And then he says this, but if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. The third principle, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. I want to go back to the comparison of the priest and the temple. These Pharisees have condemned Jesus' disciples for plucking some heads of grain to be able to eat because they're starving. And Jesus brings up these priests in the temple that work on the Sabbath. The priests in the temple work on the Sabbath in service to God and to their fellow brethren. What are these disciples doing? Who are they working for? Some would argue that this is not really saying that Jesus is greater than the temple. Even though the statement is true, no one else could make the statement that someone was greater than the temple of God except God himself. So it follows. It's true that Jesus is greater than the temple, but he's contrasting service. And Jesus says service to me. And what we're establishing here is greater than the service that takes place in the temple. There's a greater service taking place right here and right now. But then he says, but if you had known what this means, from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. What did David need to sustain himself when he went in and ate the showbread and fed his men the showbread? Do you think that he just arbitrarily did that just out of spite? Let me show you, I'm a bad dude, I can take this. No, they were probably just about starved to death. They needed sustenance. They needed, the law was not universal. There was a point where mercy should have been enacted, and in the eyes of God was enacted. Because if it had been such a rigid law, as soon as David ate the showbread, God would have done something about it. What happened to Uzzah when he touched the ark?
Immediate death.
He died. What happened when Nadab and Abihu took strange fire that they were supposed to take from the altar, but they got it from somewhere else, and they offered incense to God? What happened?
That fire burned them up.
Fire come down from heaven and consumed them. There is a place for mercy, and God knows where it fits in. David wasn't being rebellious for the sake of being rebellious. David needed food to save his life and his men. Do you think God is concerned with that? Absolutely. What is more important to God? The sacrifice of animals and the service to the temple, or of mercy and obedience? Well, in the days of Samuel, do what now?
What Linda said. She's a little hoarse.
God delights in mercy.
He does delight in mercy. And he wants us to listen. He says, do I delight in the fat of rams and in the sacrifice of these animals more than for you to listen to me? Because to listen, to hearken, is better than sacrifice. If we listened to God more, we would have to kill less, right? We'd have to sacrifice less. And what is it when we are listening to God? It's sacrifice of self. When we put ourselves out of the way and listen to God, we are in a type of way offering ourselves as a sacrifice to God. And isn't that the point of New Testament Christianity? Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your own self a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that perfect and acceptable or good will of God. The Lord wants us to be the sacrifice ourselves in service to Him. I would have mercy and not sacrifice. If you knew that, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Where two laws seem to clash or to contradict, what are we to do?
I think of Solomon immediately. I don't think it would have been right to take a sword and cut a baby in two. But he commanded that to be done.
Right.
Because the greater wisdom was he was going to find out who the true mother was.
Right. And in these situations, the more excellent law must be honored. Is it a good law that God set up that the priests only were to eat the showbread? Yeah. But mercy dictated that David and his men, so they didn't die of hunger and malnutrition, would eat the showbread. The greater law was for that the priest would do the work God had bid them do when he had told everybody else, you don't work on the Sabbath day. They honor the more excellent law. In verse 9, he says, and when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. Now, in verse 10 he says, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? And why did they ask that?
To trick him up.
Yeah, so they might accuse him. You know, some people just can't get enough. Some people, Jesus had put to shame their accusations in this previous section regarding the Sabbath day and their misappropriation of laws and commandments that had nothing to do, no connection with the heart of what God was wanting the people to obey. It's interesting in Luke chapter 6 and verse 6, corollary account of this ongoing, of this section here. It says there, Luke records that it was on another Sabbath. So some time has elapsed here. It was on a different week. They come back and they are still wanting to catch Jesus up. They are still wanting to have some reason to accuse him, some way that they can get to him.
The fact their question speaks volumes about their mindset. Is it lawful to heal? Stop there. Jesus could heal, and yet they're questioning him and not listening to his previous explanation at all.
Right.
He was able to heal people, you know,
Yeah.
on the Sabbath, on another day, whatever. How often did that come around in their lives? Not very.
You know, he had told them just prior in this, you know, if it was a week before or whatever the time was, he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is there instituting and commanding his authority over the Sabbath day. You know, in the text, Mark's text, Mark chapter 2, somebody get Mark chapter 2 and verse 27. Mark chapter 2 and verse 27.
And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath.
What's 28 say?
Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.
The Sabbath, who came first, man or the Sabbath? Well, man came first. The Sabbath, and you can't let the Sabbatarians push you around on this, because the Sabbath was not an ordinance until they came to Mount Sinai and God gave the law, and it was for Israel. It was just for Israel. Man came first, and then God made Sabbath for man. It was for man's benefit. It was for man's good. It gave them rest from their labors. Is God concerned with his beast and his animals? It gave his animals rest from their labors on the Sabbath day. It gave them needed time that they could focus and they could think about their God and service to him. And we need something to obey, right? We need to show our submission to God. He says, I am Lord of the Sabbath. I am the authority over the Sabbath. Behold, there was a man which had a withered hand. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal? A little further down, Jesus is going to say, is it lawful to do good? Is it okay for somebody to do good? I think that is so important. But some people just can't get enough. He said unto them, verse 11, what man shall there be among you? Notice he's going to sit this right back in their lap. What man among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into the pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it law to do well on the Sabbath days? You see, there were provisions, Exodus 23, Deuteronomy chapter 22, where these men that had animals, if they fell into a pit, if you were just walking on your way. Now, there were all kinds of laws about how far you could walk. You couldn't walk further than, it was like 2,000 yards or something like that. Anything more than that would have been considered breaking the law. And so on the Sabbath day, you could walk within this parameter that would be no greater than 2,000 yards from your home. And say you take you a Sabbath stroll and you go by your neighbor's place and he's got a beast in the ditch. Well, the law commanded you. You don't hide yourself. You help him get his animal out. God was commanding them to be neighborly on the Sabbath. He said, if you take your Sabbath journey and you have a neighbor with an animal that's fallen into the pit, you don't hide yourself from him. You help him. God has always been concerned with us helping each other, neighborly. He says right here that works of religion or works of humanity then are lawful on the Sabbath. The Sabbath work in the temple was lawful, and so was being a good human being. That's lawful on the Sabbath as well.
Even if it's your own animal, I can't remember whether Psalm or Proverbs about a righteous man careth for his animal.
Careth for his beast. Absolutely. And that's true. That is so true. And in verse 13, he says to the man, stretch forth thy hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. Not only did Jesus command this truth, but he practiced it. Jesus corrected their faulty view of the Sabbath day and what was lawful and what was not. He corrected it, and then he demonstrated it before them. And in another account, it says that Jesus told the man to stand up in the midst of them. Matthew just tells us that he just told him to reach his hand forth. But the other accounts tell us that Jesus told the man, you stand up right here. And before all of them, he did something that word withered literally means dried up. It was not usable. And we do not see the man saying, well, I can't do that, or that's too hard, or anything else, or who are you to tell me what to do? I've got my own personal relationship with God. A lot of people say that today, don't they? Me and Jesus are on good terms. Jesus told the man, you stretch forth your hand. Jesus told the man, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. You can't do that, Jesus. No, Jesus gives the command, and then we are responsible for submitting to that. Jesus makes the laws, right? And what happens at the end? Verse 14 here. Then the Pharisees went out and held counsel against him, how they might destroy him. What a perfect place to end, because we want to pick up here next week, because the drama gets thick. Thank you so much for your participation and your attention in this class.
Robby, was it intentionally 16 people in that picture?
I don't know. That's an AI rendering.
I don't know the answer about how many typically were in a Sanhedrin.
Well, there was 70 in the high court, but in Matthew 12:14, we see that the Pharisees took counsel. Well, Mark's account tells us that they met with the Herodians, which were enemies. They laid down their political angst against each other to join forces to fight against Jesus. The Herodians were absolutely hated by the Pharisees because they were Hellenizers. They were the ones that were pro-Rome. Rome kept them in power.
But the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. I'm going to use that next week. You say it next week. Oh, heart, hearts that long for
That's fine.
I think it's called Come Unto Me.
Yeah, there's a new preacher.
I think it's Come Unto Me.
All Robby could say is one of the
Yeah, he's
I know, but I know I had it on
says that
the,
Jesus had him stand
really
up.
good.
in the
And
program.
it's John. John said, get up. Pick up your mat.
God, good to see you.
Yeah, we don't have it in the book, but I know I have it on the paper of 7.
They limited it. There's one where it's going.
I'm just getting over something, so I'm not gonna. Hey, Mark. Mark. I don't know how to do it.
Somebody up here tomorrow, so.
Get your pitch. I said, I don't know how you do it, but your pitch is perfect.
But your pine rosin, it's a little bit crusty. I said your pine rosin. The pitch,
Hear it too, but my voice is exceptional.
I think your voice is fine. Here's the thing. So many men
Well, he went to a neurologist.
pitch it where that
And they thought maybe
top,
that
I don't even know
clot
what
was
the
gone
note
in
is
his
called,
brain when
but
it
that
did
top
it, because
note,
they found one in his
it's
heart. They
difficult
ruled that out, so he
for
went
me
to
to get
neuro.
it.
Oh, it's difficult for me to get it too.
And so that's why maybe
That
he
done some
pitched it
tests.
just
His
a little bit
long-term memory's
down,
good,
but
short-term memory's good.
I really appreciate it.
Memory.
I have my thumb squeezed in my voice box, and ever since then, I can't hit the real high note. There's a high note that I cannot hit
Yeah,
anymore.
the one that's the